As family historians, our greatest goal is to turn names and dates into rich stories that we can use to connect with our family and wider audiences. And one of the ways that I do that is by turning my interests into themes that I can then explore in the records. Hey everyone, my name is Dai Davies. I run the Geneal Cymru YouTube channel, where I talk about genealogy methods and blending genealogical research with social history. I track all kinds of different interests in my family tree, and I use an array of categories that I represent through colored boxes. I record things like farm products, interesting quotes, education, gender and sexuality, friends, religion, and many more. And as I find relevant information to those categories, I start adding them in and creating a cluster around that person in my family tree. The important thing for me is that these categories be visible to me as I pan across my tree. What it helps you do is make connections across the generations. So today I'm going to talk about one of these categories to show you how you can get from your interest into the records and then to wider social history. And the example that I'm going to use is gardening. I grew up with a love of gardening. It was something that was fostered in me, especially by my grandma and grampy. My grandma taught me to love growing flowers, and my grampy taught me the joys of growing vegetables. They and my mom had me outside all the time with them. Growing up, my grandma and grampy actually used gardening as a conduit through which to talk to me about my family history. One of the stories that I heard repeated the most was about my grampy's Uncle Dai, who grew beautiful blue roses and had a greenhouse that he used to grow tomatoes and other vegetables. He'd give those vegetables out to other family members during World War II. And this story has been told to me many, many times before, and it's one that I really cherish. When you have a place for this kind of information to go in your family tree, you can actually start to record these family stories. And also, all kinds of new records start to become genealogically relevant. So as I've been tracking the category of gardening in my family tree, I ended up finding the garden and greenhouse plans that my grampy drew up for the years 1993 to 2001. And it's not just that I get to know what kinds of foods he grew and ate at this time, because when you actually look closer at the plans, you can see more examples of family tradition. So in 1993 here, some of the seed potatoes and the pumpkin seeds actually came from my grandma's mother, my great-grandmother. And in other years, there are seeds that came from other family members and friends. Turns out that something like a garden can be an incredibly social place. And when I started to look through old family photos, I found more traces of this tradition of gardening. Here's my grampy's Uncle Dai behind the house at 24 Chemical Road in Morriston, Swansea. Behind him, you can see the smokestacks of the industrial landscape he lived in, and to his right are the glass panes of the end of his greenhouse. He probably built that greenhouse himself, much like my grampy did with his greenhouse and like my mum did with hers. This video easily could have been about carpentry and building things, which also runs down the generations in my family tree. But Uncle Dai wasn't the only person building a greenhouse and making gardens around the time of World War II. Across many different countries, including Wales, people were encouraged to grow vegetables at home or in parks. In what were known as victory or war gardens, everyday people showed their patriotism and supported the war efforts by contributing to the food supply. In this picture, if you zoom in real close here, you actually get a glimpse of the food that Uncle Dai grew for the war efforts. Bunches of tomatoes, the ones that I grew up hearing so much about. Those vegetables that helped feed our family during the war, and in times where so many of my family were unemployed. I've yet to find a photo of his roses, but here you can also see big bunches of China asters, which my grandma recently told me were his second favorite flower. It was only because I took the time to look closely at these photos that my grandma thought to share with me these new stories about his gardening that I'd never heard before. I'm also tracking this topic for even more distant ancestors. Uncle Dai's grandfather, William Davis, my 3 times great-grandfather, who lived not too far away at Maes Eglwys in Morriston, sold his farm in 1919. In the newspaper, the auctioneer actually listed the details of all his crops and livestock. He had cattle, pigs, and a number of named horses. He grew clover, horse, and meadow hay, oats, barley, potatoes, and turnip. They probably grew other vegetables in smaller quantities, but those potatoes and turnip that were a staple for him also show up in my Grandma and Grampy's garden about 75 years later. You won't always find this kind of continuity across the generations for your chosen interests, but even the practice of keeping track of them adds important depth to your research. Let's jump all the way back to the early 1700s, when my 9 times great-grandparents, David and Lettice Thomas of Betus Bledrus, wrote their wills. They practiced mixed farming, where they had their staple crops like corn, oats, and hay, and then they had all kinds of livestock: cows, oxen, horses, sheep, and pigs. After David's death in 1711, they had 8 cattle, and Lettice actually grew her herd to 21 at the time of her death in 1730. Beyond a record of what they owned, this information also shows what kind of people they were and where they fit in their community. It becomes clear that they were from the wealthier class of farmers, and it opens up doors for me to look at what the lives of socially similar people of that time and place looked like. And then I can draw connections to the kinds of lives that David and Lettice, who I know only from their wills, might have led to. Bringing together an interest, the records, and pieces of history is so important, and I really think that family trees should reflect who you are as a person. Obviously, it'll be full of your ancestors, but by infusing your own interests into a family tree, you'll end up with this rich body of research that only you could create. But the key to doing that is making sure you have an accessible place for that information to go when you do find it. So often we find these really rich records, look at them once, and then throw them in a folder never to be thought of again. The other thing is that it also doesn't just have to be your interests. I see a lot of older genealogists especially talk about how their kids or grandkids have no interest in their family history. And I think that by identifying the things that our family members value and are interested in, and then systematically searching for those things in the records, we can make better connections with them and pass along all the stories that we grew up hearing or that we learn along the way, just like my grandma and grampy did with me.